Original contributions is the most subjective category in all of the extraordinary ability visas. And this is not just about making some original work, but actually showing the impact that that work has had in the field, in the industry, not just in your company or your clients. So how do we think about this?
Yeah, so original contribution, I mean, for me, this is probably the hardest criteria of all. And it just because, as you mentioned, it's one of the most subjective. And USCIS knows that. So every single, if they want to issue an RFE, the first thing they start, that RFE is original contribution. That's always if you claim it, of course. So generally, for original contribution, if you really want to include that criteria, we have to show the impact of your work to the field, not to your employer. So that means that we have to have evidence of how your work has impacted the field, who has used your work, who has implemented your work, who has referred to your work. And sometimes for folks who work in the corporate environment, that's not easy because usually if you work for a company, everything that you do is for that employer and in order for you to get a paycheck. So that's how it works. With original contribution of major significance, it's more about how your work has impacted outside what is the impact of your work outside your employer. So, for example, sometimes, I think the easiest one is, if people have patents that are commercialized or utilized or used, we can use that for the original contribution. And USCIS has accepted that as an original contribution of major significance. Other things like maybe you wrote a book and that book is being used for training, for school curriculum. Somebody is benefiting and using your book, and that somebody can give us a letter of recommendation explaining the impact of your work to their organization.
What about papers, for example?
So papers, potentially yes, but just publishing is just part of the story. So you will publish the paper, you'll get citations, and then if you want to claim original contribution, we'll have to get letters of recommendation from the people who cited to your paper, clearly explaining the impact of your work, of what they cited to their own work.
What about other examples such as open source code, or for example, if you have a startup and you're creating something innovative that people are using?
Yeah, so with open source, it does work. So if you have your code in open source and somebody is using it, like a company is using your code, you can get a letter from that company explaining, how they're using your code and what is the impact to their organization. That's the perfect example of original contribution of major significance to the field. If you have something innovative, if you're a startup and you have a product or a method and others in the industry are using it and you have proof of that, again, through letters of recommendation, we can use that as original contribution as well.
Okay, you talked about people that worked inside of a company, right? But what if they have developed a product in that company and that product is being used by thousands and thousands of people? Can you use that or not really?
You can, you just have to be careful how you go about it because usually the most common is the client comes in and says, okay, I've developed X, Y, and Z product and it's, being used by our customers. USCIS has this thing that being used by your customers is not enough because your company has a contractual relationship with the customer, so you have to deliver that product, doesn't matter how good or how bad. So I don't think, I've tried a few times, this argument, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But, if your product is being used by thousands of people or companies, then, there is a better argument there. You just have to be careful how you create that argument.
Yeah. And what's the documentation you need in order to claim this criteria?
Usually comes in the form of letter of recommendation from the people who are using or implementing your product. So that's number one. Sometimes, obviously, if you have a patent, you'll have the patent documents. But in addition to that, you have to have a letter explaining how that patent is impacting, whoever is using the patent. Your papers, if you've written a paper, obviously copy of the paper, in addition to the letter of recommendation from, from the person who cited to your paper. So heavily driven by letters of recommendation.
Got it. So remember, this is not just about doing something original, but showing the impact it has had already in the field.